Yeah, no worries.
And just make sure everyone's on mute. Thanks, Matthew. Okay, good morning, everyone. A huge welcome. We've had hundreds of people sign up for today's webinar, which really shows the level of interest and commitment to this work across Wales. It's really fantastic to have you all with us. Just to help things run smoothly with such a large group, Matthew's already mentioned, we'd be really grateful if you could keep yourselves on mute. You're welcome to keep your cameras on, but I guess if it starts buffering, we might have to ask you to switch them off throughout the session. Matthew's already started recording today's webinar so that we can make it available on our digital hub afterwards. So I hope that's okay with everyone. Also, don't worry about trying to capture everything as we go. We'll be sharing the slides with you afterwards. They'll be uploaded to our hub, so you'll be able to access them as well after today. So by way of introduction, if you haven't attended one of our webinars before or worked with one of us, I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to the team that makes up the National Suicide Prevention and Self-Harm Programme in NHS Wales Performance and Improvement. We have Claire Cotter, who's our Head of Programme, who's on the call today and will be speaking to us later. Then we've got 3 regional leads, 2 project managers, of which I'm the Children and Young Persons Project Manager, and we've got Reese online as well, who is looking at lived experience and mapping across Wales. And then we've got a Programme Support Officer and a Senior Administrator. You'll be able to get in touch with any of us via that email on the slide there. So to outline briefly what we do as a programme, the programme is responsible for delivering the actions that are assigned to us in the national strategy.
You're on there. You've gone on mute, Anna.
I think you've muted yourself inadvertently.
Oh, I know what it was. Did you mute everyone and you muted me as well? Thank you. So, sorry, I was just saying, to outline what we do as a programme, the programme is responsible for delivering all the actions that are assigned to our programme, specifically in that national strategy. And we do this in a number of ways. So firstly, we bring organisations together across sectors and regions to support the building of a more connected and sustainable approach to suicide prevention and self-harm. Then we collaborate closely with partners to shape guidance that supports consistent practice. Hence, we've got Professor Anne John and Karen speaking today. And then another big part of our role is understanding what support people need and helping to build confidence and skills through really practical and co-produced resources and sustainable training, which will ultimately help everyone feel better equipped in prevention, intervention and postvention. And then that last point on the slide around supporting innovation. So we encourage innovation by supporting community-led projects that respond to the needs of those most at risk. And we do that through our small grants funding scheme, of which there's another round coming out fairly soon, I believe. So we always flag this up because it's a very useful resource. So the Suicide and Self-Harm Programme Digital Hub is the national online platform for suicide and self-harm learning and resources in Wales. It's open access, it's designed for both public and professionals, and it brings everything into one place. It includes free learning modules, training programmes, it's got all the key guidance, resources, and of course the events and webinars that we host, along with all the latest research and insights. It also includes what's called the Navigate page, and that's designed to help people quickly find trusted services and information on a range of risk factors that may contribute to poor mental health and vulnerability to suicide. As I said, this will all be shared afterwards. So before I introduce our speakers, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that conversations about suicide and self-harm can be really personal. They can sometimes be unexpectedly emotional for individuals, even if you deal with it on a daily basis or if you work in the sector. We may touch on things today that will feel difficult for you, and that's completely okay. So I just want to say, please look after yourselves in whatever way you need to, whether that's taking a break and stepping away from the webinar for a moment, or whether it's calling one of the support lines on the slide. My colleague's going to be putting a link in the chat, which will direct you to these helplines once I've moved past this slide. But your well-being comes first, so do whatever feels right for you throughout the session. And now I'd like to introduce you to today's speakers who'll be leading us through what I'm sure will be a really practical and insightful session. We're really lucky to have Professor Anne John from the National Centre for Suicide Prevention and Self-Harm Research, and she's going to share the evidence from research and help us to understand the challenges that young people are facing right now, but framing it within the school context. And then after that, we'll hear from Karen Hughes, who will present research on education and mental health and ACEs and talk about bringing in the voices of children with lived experience. And then, as I mentioned earlier, to close the session, we'll have Claire Cotto, who's head of our programme for the Suicide and Prevention Self-Harm team. And she's going to share updates around the current guidance and safeguarding procedures. So we're really grateful to have each of them joining us today. I know their perspectives will be really valuable. We do have a lot to pack into this 1 hour webinar, so I don't think there'll be an opportunity for questions. That said, please put any questions in the chat and either Karen or Professor Anne John or one of our team might be able to answer them. And if we don't online, then we can perhaps send those questions and answers out to you after today. So that's it from me. I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to Professor Anne John. So over to you, Anne.
I've been muted, so thanks so much. I'm just going to share my slides. So is that working?
Yep, that's working.
Perfect. A huge thank you for asking me to come and talk on this webinar. I've done lots of work based in schools, but I guess we all bring our work expertise here, but I'm also, you know, I've got 3 kids, I was a former school governor, I've worked clinically and across public health Wales, and I've given, over the years, I've been involved with many schools following a death from a child, which is just deeply tragic across the whole community. I actually am not going to cover that today. I'm going to focus particularly on what happens in schools. So I'm going to do a bit of definitions to make sure that we're all on a similar page, and then talk about some of the problems with delivering evidence-based interventions in schools, which I'm sure many of you will be completely aware of. So where are we starting? You know, when we think about children, as you all know, there's a lot going on. So it's not like working with many of the other populations older populations where we're thinking about transitions that are happening in their lives, you know, employment, unemployment, relationship breakdown. There's a lot going on with young people. There's all sorts of biological things that we can see in their brains, you know, things like, we call it synaptic pruning. They think differently to us. I'm sure that's really obvious to all of you. It really strikes me when I'm talking with young people about how they view, you know, self-harm behaviours and thoughts about suicide, sometimes quite differently to the way we might do as adults. And in many ways, that's to be expected with all the things going on for them biologically. But they're also undergoing psychological development, so sense of self, independence, self-esteem, decision-making, the future thinking. They are at a stage of, you know, I used to work particularly in early years. I started doing a lot of work in children and young people and adolescents because I think it's a stage where we can make a real difference. But, and you can see this on brain scans, their social and emotional development is very different to us. So their experience of peer rejection, being left out, lights them up on a scan in a way that it doesn't do for us. Now, some of that is learning those skills about how to deal with those things, learning that things pass, that, you know, a relationship breaks down, you will love again. But these are all big touch points in their development that can make them vulnerable, but also open to change. And then in this, here in schools, we're basically talking about children up to the age of 18. But usually when I talk about children and young people, I'm actually talking about people between the ages of about 8 to 24, because those are the ages that all these developmental, biological, psychological, and social are all happening. And we are currently in a world where we have the largest youth population in history. So what is self-harm? So we have lots of debate, you know, myself and the suicide and self-harm team have worked with lots of people about what the definition is. Because I work in research, I need a definition, because we need to know that we're all talking about the same thing. And the accepted definition is intentional self-injury or self-poisoning, irrespective of motivation or intent or purpose. And that's because for each episode of self-harm, the method and the motivation can change. And so we always feel like we're talking about one thing, but for an individual and between individuals, it's often different. You know, some people might be ambivalent, some people can be managing their distress through self-harming. But it is an important signal of distress, and it's an opportunity to provide intervention and support. And both in health and education, if you talk to young people who self-harm, their experiences are not always positive. And I think a lot of that is to do with the stigma that health and education practitioners experience in terms of not knowing what to do, fear of making things worse. And I guess one of the big messages to come out of today is asking directly and responding non-judgmentally is absolutely important for future help seeking and does not put any ideas into anyone's head. I'm going to talk a lot about data. We always say data are lives. You know, sometimes it might come across as a bit unemotional. I'm talking about facts and figures and rates. But, you know, I am very conscious that we're talking about people's lives. So just to acknowledge that straight up. So what this graph is showing us is suicide rates in men and women, dark blue are men, males, across the population. What you'll often hear people say is that suicide is one of the leading causes of death in young people. It is. But if you look at this graph, what you can see is that actually the rate is much lower, is the lowest compared to other age groups. Now, the reason that it's still one of the biggest killers is because young people are dying from other things. So, you know, so the rates are highest in middle-aged men, but middle-aged men are also dying from heart disease and respiratory disease and cancer. So it's a really important cause of death. The other thing you'll always hear is that suicide rates in children have been rising since sort of like 2010. Now, for about a decade, that was really true. However, since about 2018, we haven't seen an increase. Now, I think what I always say when I say we haven't seen an increase is we haven't seen a decrease either. And every one of these deaths is deeply tragic and ripples through schools and wider communities. So, you know, what we're all here because we want to see a decrease. And then what this graph is showing you is that particularly for males, suicide is worse in more deprived communities. So that speaks about the catchment areas that you're in. And so suicide prevention is really about social injustice. It's a big driver there. So this is self-harm. So if you think about suicide, we saw 3 or 4 times the rates of suicide in males than in females. Whereas for self-harm, rates are much higher in females, particularly older adolescent females. So that 15 to 19-year-old group, the light blue line is girls, and this is the age group in schools. We are seeing self-harm happening in much younger children over time. And we see across males and females, whereas for suicide, the numbers were such that we didn't really see it for females, that social gradient, it gets the more deprived areas, we see more self-harm. You know, so that speaks to schools' catchment areas and needs and focus. However, most self-harm doesn't present to services, and those figures I just showed you were about contacts with primary care, with hospital services. So about 1 in 10 14 and 15-year-olds will be self-harming in a school. So in a class of 30, you'll have about 3. That often surprises people. Of those, only about 1 in 8 will present to services. And then the numbers that die by suicide are much, much smaller. You know, so suicide is a relatively rare outcome. So why are schools important? So we know that self-harm is increasing. 10 years ago, when people said to me, is it increasing? I would say, well, we're seeing more people contact services, more young people contact services, but that could be a good thing, they're help seeking. But actually, big surveys are showing us that over time, since the year 2000, self-harm has been increasing in the community and young people. In England, they do a survey, and what you can see is that about 9% of 8 to 16-year-olds with a probable mental health disorder are self-harming. So, you know, this is a problem in schools. It's happening. We know there are things that we can do. So if you think about some of the risk factors associated with self-harm, about 1/5 of deaths by suicide by children and young people are associated with suicide-related internet use. You know, there's lots we can do about responsible internet use. We recently published a paper showing that for every increase in academic pressure, in the way that we measure it with a questionnaire, you see an 8% higher risk of self-harm. What that says to me is that's a modifiable factor. And then it's strongly associated with in-person bullying.
Anne, you're on mute again, sorry. Just because I think we've tried to, because if everybody can stay on mute, that would be helpful. But Anne, just to check. I'm just wondering if Matthew has done a go.
Oh, there we are.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Claire. So we did another study where we looked at bullying and self-harm. Unsurprisingly, that does increase self-harm, whether it's online or in person. But what we also found in that study was loneliness increases self-harm, and addressing loneliness, particularly over the summer holidays, so setting up things can absolutely be protective. So thinking about loneliness and belonging in schools and those relationships with trusted adults are really important. So school is not a mental health service. You know, we all accept that. We under the we understand the pressures in schools, but it is an opportunity to promote healthy behaviours and life skills so that pupils are equipped to meet life's challenges. But schools are complex, in my world, we call complex public health settings in complex systems. You know, there's a massive policy and society emphasis, both on mental health and on schools to address some of these things. And there are lots of programmes going on. You know, we're very lucky in Wales to have schools counsellors, CAMS InReach in our secondary schools. But there's also a vast number of packages and programmes and ways of delivering things. And many of these lack real evidence, or there's evidence of no impact, or sometimes they do harm to certain sectors. The reason we need evidence-based programmes emphasised and prioritised is because when you've got a limited pot of money, you want the most effective programmes to be implemented. Another great thing that we have in Wales is the whole school approach. So we've got that partnership, you know, we've embedded the principle that that schools don't live in isolation. You know, they're part of family networks, community networks, and student voice. So, what are universal interventions? So you might have heard like universal, selected, indicated. I remember when I first got taught these, and they're very much back in the day, and they're hard to hold in your head, I think, as terms. But what they are is a universal intervention goes out to the whole school. It doesn't think about who's at risk and who's not at risk. A selected intervention goes to the people we know who are at risk. So that might be, you know, people who've been bullied or young people in care. An indicated one is those who already, you know, the one having a very tough, where it's, you know, someone who's self-harming. So prevention tends to be based around universal interventions. Goes out in the whole school. It's good for building skills, it's good for prevention. The other reason it works is it's not stigmatizing. When we look at indicated and selected interventions, we're pulling specific children into specific interventions. We need to do that sometimes, but it can be stigmatizing and uptake can be poor. And then we come to what's called Rose's paradox. These are like the foundations for seeing why what I'm going to present in the evidence. So the great thing about universal interventions is when you do things for the whole population, you can make a little change in a lot of young people. And that has an impact at a population level. But when I'm trying to test that in a trial and build evidence, it's really hard to measure small impacts. And it means that lots of trials will go, oh, don't know, did we make a difference? Don't really know. And it's a real problem with the evidence. And in research, we like to publish things that give us a positive impact. So it just means we over-egg things. So when we look at trials, there was a big trial on mindfulness called the Myriad trial for emotional difficulties. At a universal level, it made no difference. In fact, for some more vulnerable kids, there were signals that it made things worse. So things that we think work or aren't going to do any harm, when you implement them universally in schools, can be tricky. And some of that is it's hard to implement things in schools because they're complex public health settings. And it's hard to stay true to what was tested in a trial. So these are some of the issues. So a good few years back, so 2015, seems like a different world now, there was a massive trial published in 10 European countries, 168 schools. This is as good as it gets. It was a youth aware of mental health programme called GWEMINAR. So it was basically mental health literacy. And it impacted suicide attempts. You know, they measured the outcome. Lots of these trials don't actually measure what we're interested in. It measures whether it improves our knowledge and awareness. So people like me were very excited by this trial. We thought, we've got the solution. We can do that. Let's get on with it. But schools, complex public health settings. So the Department for Education in England funded the Aware and Inspire trials. These were big trials, 32,000 pupils. One of the things they tested was YAM. They also did other things for emotional difficulties. YAM, there were short-term improvements, but longer term, it increased emotional difficulties, especially in schools that had no experience of delivering universal mental health programs. What a nightmare. So what that's basically telling us is, you know, we can't recommend the implementation of YAM in schools. There's also ethical things when you're doing things universally. You know, you're delivering things to children who are well in a compulsory way. So we need to feel responsible that we're doing no harm. But one of the big things that came out of these two trials, they were interrupted by COVID. One was the need for resources to implement things, to think about whether you bring people in or train teachers, and that we need to. So things where we may feel like they're not going to do any harm, we really need to think about whether they do. So what comes up in terms of what we need to be doing in schools? So staff training is the big thing. How to respond to children to self-harm disclosures, increasing knowledge, confidence and skills. There's a wealth of research out there, and we see it when we do workshops with you all, is that sometimes it's not just stigma that can stop people from responding. It's because they're worried about saying or doing the wrong thing. So staff training can address that. Self-harm can sometimes be mismanaged as bad behaviour or minimised, you know, stop doing that. That happens in health as well. And really the culture around that really needs to be addressed. School climate makes a difference. Academic stress, bullying, these are all strongly associated. And we have limited evidence. And most of universal school-based programs, the evidence is uncertain. It's not really clear. And that's why we need universal interventions and targeted strategies and thinking about best practice. One of the things that's being talked about extensively at the moment is about teaching about suicide in schools. I'm not going to give you an answer to this. I'm going to give you things to think about. Any death of a child in a school is deeply tragic and distressing. It challenges everyone. It challenges staff, pupils, parents, the wider community, everyone working around it. There are around 105 suicides a year in under 18s in England and Wales put together. We absolutely need, you know, the team are developing, you know, working with the National Centre. There are lots of resources around supporting people after a death by suicide in schools. In this area, some of the biggest and best changes in suicide prevention that I've seen in my career have come from bereaved campaigners. You know, the change in the burden of proof in coroners' courts, where a suicide death originally, it was treated like a criminal burden of proof. And now it's the same as all other deaths. That came from Papyrus, the Molly Rose Foundation, the Three Dads Walking, Gambling with Lives. It's really powerful. And most people agree that openness about suicide in schools addresses stigma and shame. You need to feel equipped when a young person talks about their experiences or comes to tell you about something. But what does teaching mean? Is it about mental health literacy? Is it about risk factors? Is it a discussion? Is it about improving help seeking, improving, teaching young people when to get an adult, a trusted adult in the school involved? Should we talk about self-harm? We know it's rising. We know it's appearing in younger age groups. We know these discussions are happening. If we've got 3 children in every class, young people are talking about this. Teachers and parents may feel uncomfortable about that, but they are. So would it be better to have things from a trusted source? What's the appropriate age? Who will do it? What about teacher training? A big myth is that thing about if you ask or talk about it, it'll make things worse. There's no evidence that when someone raises this issue with you, that talking about it, speaking non-judgmentally, will make things worse or plant ideas. There's literally no evidence about that. There's lots of research about asking young people from the age of 8 onwards about whether asking them very directly about thoughts of suicide, not making things worse. That's not the same as teaching.
Anne, sorry to say, we're just running out of time. I just want to make sure Karen's got time.
Cool. The RHSE guide, the big problem we have about teaching directly is about the idea of making self-harm available as a way of coping with distress and normalizing it. But promoting help seeking and stories of recovery are good things. So the RHSE guidance in England doesn't say that suicide prevention needs to be taught, but it does focus on general mental health where suicide prevention starts. So talking about emotions, looking after your own well-being, what to do when you're concerned about your own or others' well-being, how and when to get support, worries about friendship, bullying, loneliness, what to do, when things go wrong in life, relationship breakdown, coping with setbacks. But if it comes back, teachers need to not feed the symptoms. Need to think about safer ways of coping. So schools don't have to address suicide directly, but if they choose to, should do with caution and talk to experts. Training teachers is really important. Clear policies is really important. Take into account age, maturity, personal experience, parents' views. Schools have a role. I'll whiz through these slides. So there was a pilot study. Pilot studies are just about seeing if something could work. Could we test this? It doesn't give you answers. This pilot study, it's a great study. It's a great intervention. But it was only 2 schools. It was and they were the schools that volunteered out of all the schools in Northwest England, which means they self-selected. So what we found there may not apply to all schools. There weren't any issues around safety, but what a pilot study tells you is you need to do a big study. And that big study has been funded. So the evidence is coming about whether that teaching, which is one of the components of this study, is safe to do and brings benefits. We know that absence and exclusion are associated with self-harm. So pupils who are persistently absent have 2 times the rate. Those who are excluded, it's 7 times. You know, these children have risk factors that we need to be addressing. So as a result of all that work and speaking at an inquiry, we have developed guidance. We co-produced it. We had a webinar with 600 educators. It has practical advice about non-judgmental conversations, about not making assumptions. It talks about, you know, where your responsibilities start and end. You know, doing too much can sometimes be as tricky as doing too little. All of that's in the guidance, but we did a survey. 3/4 of the people we talked to had forgotten it even existed. And what they wanted was a digital document, not a PDF. So one of the things, so we are currently in the process of addressing that. So this is my last slide and I will stop. Academic success is really tied in with mental health, self-harm behaviours, belonging and loneliness. All these things are intricately interdependent. So they are schools' business. Higher attainment in school, so doing well in school, is a real determinant of positive trajectories. You know, so I'm not saying that doing well is not important. It is. It supports problem-solving skills. Its future trajectories are important, but all the stresses that we talk about are common in young people. Most come through without serious harm. Most need support for management of family factors, so maltreatment, bullying, social isolation, mental health conditions, substance use. Schools should work with other agencies for early identification, assessment and management. Teaching skills is where it's at. Online safety, social and emotional life skills, dating and relationship and help seeking. We've just funded, the Welsh Government has just funded a big intervention to test help seeking, training test help seeking in schools. Teachers need training. You know, I think that is the big thing to be focusing on. Embed policies and pathways so people know what to do. They feel safe to have those conversations. Parental engagement, mentorship and belonging are really important. And implementation is where it's at. So I'm just going to give a plug for the BSI standard. There's lots of things in that standard about how to have conversations, what policies should contain. Yesterday, the Prime Minister mentioned it in PMQs, which is very exciting. And sign up to our newsletters in the National Centre. We do lots of work in this area, and you know, you can hear it as it happens. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. I think that's a really helpful overview of the context and what that can mean for how schools address, manage and respond to these issues. I'm going to hand over to Karen now, because I think it's really important that we listen to what children and young people themselves say they see a need. And so Karen's going to focus on bringing their voices into this. So Karen, it's over to you.
Can you let me know when you can see my slides when they're up?
Yes, they're not in presenter mode yet. There we go, fine.
All right, perfect, thank you. As a Good morning, everyone, and thank you. I'm Karen Hughes from Public Health Wales, and I'm going to talk a bit about the support needs of young people exposed to adverse childhood experiences who are a key group who are vulnerable to poorer mental health and suicide and self-harm. So much of what I'm going to talk about is the findings from a study that's been done as part of a PhD programme in collaboration with ourselves and Swansea University, the students called Flo Avery. So just an acknowledgement to her for leading on this. But just as a way of background, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the phrase adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, as they're commonly shortened to. It's basically an umbrella term to describe a range of potentially traumatic experiences that children can have while growing up that affect them either directly, such as being a victim of abuse or neglect, or affect the environment in which they live, so living in a household with domestic violence or substance abuse. And we know that these kinds of experiences are among the strongest predictors of poor health and social well-being right across the life course. And we've looked at this in Wales in several studies now. We've done 5 studies on ACEs in adults in the general population over the last 10 years, I'd say, surveying over 10,000 adults and asking them about a consistent set of ACEs. So 3 types of child maltreatment, verbal, physical and sexual abuse, and 6 types of household difficulties: parental separation and living in a household with mental illness, domestic violence, problem alcohol use, drug use, and incarceration. And across adults in Wales, these are the prevalence levels that we see. So ranging from about 23% saying that they experienced verbal abuse in childhood or parental separation, down to about 4% saying that they lived with a household member who was incarcerated. But when you bring it all together, we see that around about half of all adults in Wales have experienced at least one of these events whilst growing up, and around, well, just over 1 in 10 say that they've experienced 4 or more. And we see in the data that the more exposure people have to ACEs during childhood, the greater their vulnerability to poor outcomes throughout life. So just as an example, compared to those adults in Wales who haven't experienced any of these ACEs, those who've experienced 4 or more of them are twice as likely to be high-risk drinkers, 4 times as likely to have low mental well-being, 5 times as likely to have used cannabis, 6 times more likely to have been diagnosed with a mental illness, 8 times more likely to be a victim of violence, and 10 times more likely to report having had suicidal thoughts or self-harm. And this very strong relationship with suicidal thoughts or self-harm is reflected in many other studies as well. And while we've looked at adults, there is increasingly data emerging for younger people on the relationship between ACEs. And for example, longitudinal data from England shows that ACEs experienced in both early childhood and mid-childhood or adolescence increases the risk of adolescents having depression and self-harming. And in Northern Ireland, a study found that for each additional ACE reported by 11 to 19-year-olds, it increased their risk of self-harm and suicide ideation by 88%. So we haven't looked at this specifically in mental health in Wales, but we have looked using our data back at some other markers of childhood wellbeing, and we see that having multiple ACEs is associated with a substantially increased risk of people reporting poor health during childhood, high levels of school absenteeism, lower levels of school belonging, being bullied at school, and leaving school with no educational qualifications. So a clear impact of ACEs, not only on mental illness and but also on their ability to engage with and succeed within the school setting. So just establishing schools is a really important setting for responding to this. So what we wanted to do with the study that we did with Swansea was we've got a lot of data on adults and the impact of ACEs across the life course, but of course what we really need to know is how ACEs are affecting young people now and how we can better support them. And we also wanted to know, could we ask young people about ACEs as well? Would they be willing to discuss them with us? So one of the first things we did was a survey of 16 to 18-year-olds within Wales. We used an online questionnaire to ask about 11 types of adverse childhood experiences, and where young people reported these to ask about the perceptions of support that they'd receive for them. So we recruited young people from college campuses and through social media. We got 670 participants in total, of whom over 80% reported at least one ACE. So this isn't comparable to our figures that we have with adults, because they are representative surveys, whereas this isn't. So these are people who've self-selected to complete the questionnaire. But what it does tell us is that it's likely that young people who have experienced ACEs were more attracted towards the survey, and that they were happy to complete it. So just looking at those who experienced an ACE, so the sample is 559 young people. These are the ACEs that they reported. So the top ones, living with somebody affected by mental illness or parental separation, was reported by about half of the young people. Emotional neglect, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse by about a third. But when you bring these together, about 43% of the sample who'd experienced ACEs had experienced 4 or more different types. So we are looking at that particularly vulnerable group of young people. So we asked, whenever someone reported an ACE, we asked them whether they felt they'd received enough help and support with the situation. For example, did they have someone to talk to? Did they understand the help that was available to them? And this shows the proportion that reported each of the ACEs, whether they responded no, which is the pink bar, they didn't feel they received enough help or support, or blue is yes, and grey is don't know. But it's clear here that more people are saying that they didn't feel that they received enough support than did. So for the top ones, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, emotional neglect, over 2/3 of young people who reported these experiences said that they didn't feel that they'd received enough help and support. And even at the bottom, household mental illness or family involvement with police or prison, these were where you might expect services to be more involved with the family. We're still seeing only 44% of young people saying that they felt they had enough, that they didn't have enough support, and a third saying that they did. So a clear gap in the levels of support that young people are getting to help them with their ACEs. So we asked young people who reported ACEs, we gave them the opportunity to leave comments to us on the support that they'd received or what they would have liked. And this qualitative data free text was then analysed and drawn out with 5 key themes that came through, which were then looked at in a workshop with young people with lived experience to kind of make sense of them all. And the 5 key themes are stigma and non-disclosure, help me by helping my family, talking to a trusted adult, loneliness and peer support, and the importance of schools and colleges as sites of support. And there's a lot of crossover between these. So while schools and colleges was pulled out as a specific theme, it also kind of crossed across all the other themes as well. So I'm just going to talk through a little about these key themes now and some of the quotes that the young people gave us. So for the first one, stigma and non-disclosure, I mean, it was clear from responses that many young people hadn't told anyone about their ACEs. They had difficulty talking to them, or they didn't have anyone to speak to about them. So a quote, I never knew where or how to speak to people about my feelings. I bottled it all up and kept them to myself. And not many people know about it, and it feels embarrassing to talk about it. So some young people directly linked their feelings, their ACEs, to feelings of stigma and feeling embarrassed or ashamed, or saying that even though other people knew about it, it was never spoken about. They were aware of the stigma around ACEs, which made it more difficult for them to talk about it. And there's often an assumption that people don't want to talk about difficult experiences, as Anne mentioned in her presentation, but actually this was felt by the young people to be more isolating and less supportive, and they'd rather be approached and spoken to about their experiences. So I wish it would have been a topic which people felt comfortable to speak to me about, instead of isolating my situation. And her being open about it and the resources available to me to be able to learn more about it was helpful. So while more young people mentioned a lack of support or poor support than positive support. Some talked about being kept in the loop as being helpful and reassuring in dealing with their ACEs, though overall young people didn't feel really well informed about their experiences, and they were unsure, you know, whether they were entitled to help or how to access help. So help me by helping my family. Young people highlighted that you know, appropriate support for their family would be directly beneficial to them. For example, support from my dad would have benefited me because I was the one looking after him, which put a massive strain on me, my education, and my mental and physical health. But they didn't want family members to be blamed for their experiences, and they didn't see themselves as victims of their family circumstances, but rather saw ACEs as complex events that affected their wider family. So my mum has PTSD and anxiety, but she's an amazing mum and she's always there for me. And if you're used to it or you want to defend your family, a person may be hesitant or reluctant to reach out for help or downplay it. So the young people weren't really viewing ACEs as single events or in isolation, but rather they were kind of specific to their family makeup and difficult to separate from it, which can make it harder to ask for help. So the support that young people kind of talked about needing wasn't necessarily for one adverse experience, but rather to help them make sense of the wider events or patterns that they were experiencing in their family lives. Talking to a trusted adult, I mean, many young people talked about the importance of having a trusted adult to talk to about their experiences, and who the adult is, whether it's a friend, a family member, or a teacher, or another professional, was less important than the characteristics of that person. So, you know, words such as trusted, caring, empathetic, confidential were used to describe the adults who'd helped them or who they wished had helped them. So an alternative adult in my life who I could trust or rely on, and to let me talk about what I had to go through without judgment and to keep it private. But there were also difficulties in talking about or raising the issue of ACEs, including that perception that if they tried to talk about them, they wouldn't be welcomed. And there were quite a few negative comments as well about the experiences, including therapists and CAMHS practitioners. So I find it hard to talk about my experiences as it makes me feel shameful, putting my problems onto other people. And I struggle to talk about my feelings. Because of this, the CAMHS people told my mum I refused to engage. So, you know, several young people described telling people about ACEs and there being no follow-up or offer of help, which could make them feel it wasn't worth sharing. And words such as ignored and patronised and invisible kind of described the frustrations that young people felt in their attempts to access support from professionals. Loneliness and peer support was loneliness was a theme that spread throughout many of the comments, with several participants talking about trying to cope alone and not getting the help that they needed, and not getting help because they didn't tell anyone or have anyone to talk to. So I didn't have anybody that I could turn to for help, as I felt nobody actually cared what I was going through. And it's hard to ask for help when you don't know what's actually happening with your own mental health. And there was quite a lack of distinction between ACEs and mental health. While we were asking young people about what support they needed for ACEs, the responses sometimes didn't mention ACEs at all, but focused very much on mental health. So they were seen as kind of interchangeable. But the young people also gave recommendations around the kind of support they would like, around coping mechanisms and social support, particularly through peer support. I would have liked to have known more about the experiences of others in similar situations to mine and the struggles and coping mechanisms they had. And I would have liked to have been given coping mechanisms, communication skills, and had the people who were supporting me to be more empathetic. And this kind of theme clearly linked into the importance of schools as the site of support. So many young people commented on support they'd received in school or that they would have liked to have received. And some specifically said that they wish they'd been noticed at school as a way of receiving help. So I never really spoke to anyone about how I felt, and I wish I'd had more support in primary school. And I continually missed school and came in distress, and no teacher reached out to me. But while the experiences that participants reported at school varied widely, even those that had negative experiences talked about this in a way that they felt it was an appropriate place to receive help. And there were several comments specifically highlighting the positive interactions that they'd had with school staff and the support that they gave them, both at a low level of just them checking in and being supportive and empathetic. So I found the staff showing that they care about me by checking on me and doing stuff with me. It was helpful, leading up to the more in-depth support that teachers were providing to young people about, you know, developing awareness and education and skills and coping mechanisms that were really valued. So one teacher gave me loads of support and helped me by talking through what was going through my head, educating me more on mental health and giving me coping techniques. And this support was immense. So overall, school support was viewed positively by young people, and many people had received support through their school or college, and if they hadn't, they wished that they had. And school staff that included teachers, teaching assistants, school-based counsellors were mentioned as helping young people to understand ACEs, and were seen as a trusted adult they could speak to about their feelings. And it wasn't necessarily that they were looking for specific interventions. It was more just having that caring kind of like safe space within the school where they felt supported. And so there were recommendations put forward that schools should do more in general, but specifically that staff should receive more training to enable them to provide support, and for interventions like school-based peer support groups as well were brought out quite strongly. So the full findings from this study are freely available online. I've put them up here. As part of her PhD, Flo's also been looking at what can be done with school-aged youth to support people with trauma-based interventions that are non-clinician-led, because of course these can be very expensive. So, you know, what can be done you know, just by teachers or other school staff to support young people with ACEs within the school environment. But I also, just to finish, want to mention I work alongside the ACE Hub in Public Health Wales, who are implementing the Trauma Informed Wales framework for Wales, which is looking for a societal approach to understanding adversity, trauma, and creating just generally a culture of kindness and empathy and understanding throughout Wales. So everything from broad societal awareness of what adversity and trauma is, how they can affect people, how that people can support people, up to services and specialist clinical interventions. And within this, there's a range of resources for schools available on Hub if people don't know about them. And I think this is really important, as we talked about. It's not just about a single training program, it's about making sure that the whole school environment is set up to understand and deliver the issues that young people have. So within these, sorry, I've gone the wrong way. It tells you what the Trauma Informed Wales framework is, what it means to be a trauma-informed school. It provides a toolkit for schools if they want to look at it, and there's free training available as well for primary and secondary schools, and also contact details for the ACE Hub, who I know would be very enthusiastic to talk to any schools who are interested in this. So thank you very much indeed, and I hope that was useful.
Thank you so much, Karen. I think for me, one of the key takeaways from today, and something that I hope feels really genuinely reassuring for people, is that schools aren't expected to have all the answers. And what really matters is creating that safe, trusting environment where children and young people can be seen, heard and supported. So if there's one thing to take away, it's that you're not alone in this work. You don't need to do it perfectly to make a positive impact. And on that, I'm going to quickly go over to Claire Cotter for the last word about things that can help us to do this and some changes that are coming up. So Claire, right over to you.
Hi, just trying to turn myself off. I appreciate we've come to the end of the webinar. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. Can you see that, Hannah? Can just about see your face.
Yes, that's fine.
So I don't need to say much, really. A huge thank you to Anne and Karen for presenting all of that evidence base at pace. There's a lot there, but as we say, we're going to be sharing the proceeds from this session, so you can catch up with that. Anne mentioned this guidance, and Hannah has done a lot of work engaging with people like yourselves, possibly many of you already on the call with this guidance. This was done not just in the previous government in Wales, but the one before that possibly. But as you will all know, we now have a new administration in Wales. So this is Welsh Government guidance, so we're just waiting for things to settle there. But just to say that this guidance is quite comprehensive, still evidence-based and available online. So there was a link put in the chat bar for you. Just to say that we are working on this and looking at, Hannah's done some evaluation work on it, and we're working with Anne to bring that up to speed. But we're also working with our colleagues in safeguarding, and Hannah has convened a group of safeguarding professionals from across sectors within education and across education to look at how self-harm is referenced throughout these procedures, but also looking at developing a practice guide which will cover quite a lot of the issues that maybe we've picked up today. Obviously, we'd be looking for that to be evidence informed, very much so. These are the headings that tend to come up in all of those practice guides. So we've got a very clear framework to work around. So just to say that, you know, thank you. There's a lot to absorb, isn't there? We've had a lot of insights today, a lot of reflection. Please don't hesitate to get in touch with us as a programme. Either through the generic email or through Hannah, if you have any thoughts going forward. But also, finally, it's 11:02. We've slightly run over. Thank you, both Anne and Karen. Lovely to see so many of you on the call, and please don't hesitate to get in touch going forward. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah,
Enjoy
thank
the
you
rest
all.
of your day.
Have a good day. Bye.